Good evening, everyone. My name is Stephanie Sobeck-Swand. I'm the Executive Director of RARE, and I'm broadcasting here tonight from the lovely city of Kitchener. As a fairly recent arrival to Canada, I consider myself a guest in this territory. The RARE Charitable Research Reserve acknowledges and is grateful to all of the original stewards of the land on which RARE resides, within the Haldimand Tract spanning 6 miles on either side of the Grand River from source to mouth. Understanding that this land has been rich in diverse Indigenous presence since time immemorial, there are several Indigenous nations that we would like to mention. We would like to honor and respect the sovereignty of both First Nations in our area, the Haudenosaunee peoples of 6 nations of the Grand River, and the Anishinaabe people of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Nyawa and Miigwech to these nations who share their lands with us. We'd also like to acknowledge the neutral peoples and their ancestor, and the indigenous paleo hunters who resided on these lands as long as 10,500 years ago. I would also like to acknowledge those indigenous peoples who currently live, work, and learn in the urban landscape around us, such as other self-identified and status First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. As an organization that is committed to reconciliation with all Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, we recognize that our land acknowledgement is really only a first step in the process of healing and building better relationships with one another and with the land and waters. We will continue to honor our commitment to reconciliation through staff and volunteer cultural competency training, a creation of meaningful and systemic policy amendments that accommodate Indigenous guests and employees at RARE, braiding Indigenous knowledge, truthful histories, and understanding of local treaty rights and responsibilities into our programs, and creating opportunities for Indigenous engagement and employment. I'm very happy to welcome you to RARE's second Conversation for Conservation tonight. We are really pleased to have you join us here for this second event. And if you joined us in January for our first conversation, you will know that this has been an exciting year for RARE already, because we are celebrating our 20th anniversary. And tonight, we're actually also celebrating St. Patrick's Day by going green together. And I'm very happy that we welcome Dr. Andrew Trant today, who is an assistant professor at the University of Waterloo and will be our special guest and speaker tonight. Following tonight's event, we are pleased to offer also a free screening of the film Call of the Forest, available to you anytime over the next 5 days. We hope you enjoy the film and learn more about the science and enchantments that forests provide us with. The last days to stream the film will be Sunday, March 21st, so you have the whole weekend, which is actually also the International Day of Forests. And we are so pleased to be able to offer these important conversations and films as a way to connect together and connect to nature, even through this medium here like Zoom, and even from inside our homes. Forests really are an essential ecosystem, and protecting them and connecting with them is absolutely critical to everyone's health and well-being. And as you know, today was a beautiful day, and we have been some
Hello, everybody. We seem to have had a technical hiccup, so I will start. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm really excited to be here. So I am an assistant professor at the University of Waterloo in the School of Environment, Resources, and Sustainability. And so okay. So hopefully you see this. And so yeah, I am really excited to be here tonight talking to you about conservation and about some issues that are very near and dear to my heart. I'm sitting here alone in my attic, but truly nothing happens alone. And I have a family that's hiding downstairs. Things are quiet right now, and that's really good news for everybody. And I'm also here representing a fantastic group of graduate students, undergrad students, postdocs, and collaborators that are all engaged in the work that I'm going to be talking about tonight. So I am up here alone, but I'm really surrounded by people. I'm also really excited to be talking about some newer work that I have recently initiated with RARE with one of my PhD students, Kyle Shang, who is featured here in the top right. Okay, so keeping with the theme tonight of St. Patrick's Day, lots of talk and thoughts of things that are green, I want to tell you two different stories tonight around conservation. They both are stories of climate change, but they're both really different. So in one case, there's a story about greening that we don't want, and another story about greening that we can't do without. The processes that are involved with what we're talking about today, there's two of them. The first one has to do with more greenery, more biomass, from smaller trees to bigger trees, bigger shrubs, just more of everything on the landscape. And the second part is thinking about plants and trees that are expanding their range and growing further north than they would have before. So they're adapted to a certain climate, certain conditions, and for plants and trees to track that climate in order to have that same suitable climate that they need to disperse there. They're stuck in the ground, and so this happens through seed dispersal. The metric that we're going to be thinking about tonight, and it's going to keep popping its head into different parts of the story, is something that we refer to as Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. It's a total mouthful. Even the acronym stinks. NDVI is not a very great acronym, but really we're thinking about greening. This is the only equation that is going to appear on the slides. So if you love equations, this one's for you. If you don't, then you can just shut your eyes for a minute. So this greening index, so NDVI, is all about looking at differences in infrared light and red light. And so we know that big plants and browning plants use and absorb and reflect light differently. And it's because of these properties that we can start to use satellite images to look at patterns of greening. So here's an example of a green plant. And what we have here is that it's absorbing more red light and reflecting more infrared. Whereas the brown plant is reflecting more red light and absorbing more infrared. So these subtle differences allow us to create a greening value from these satellite images, which is really a game changer with the scale at which we think about a lot of these issues. So these data are coming from satellites, and I'm showing this Landsat here. And we have good satellite coverage from the early to mid 80s to present day. So we have a sizable record. And newer on the scene are the use of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, kind of endearingly referred to as drones. And they allow us to go out ourselves and collect these same kinds of data with some subtle differences. And so I have here some UAV data on the left and some satellite data on the right. And I feel like this is one of those games in the newspaper where you have to identify the 5 differences. But you can see on the left that the pixel size is smaller. So it has higher resolution. You can differentiate individual trees, and you can even identify down to the species level. So much higher resolution, but you can't capture the same scale of image. So we are limited to line of sight. You have to be able to see the drone in order to fly the drone, and you're limited by battery power too. There is also the satellite images that have lower resolution. As you can see, the pixel size is larger, but you have incredible spatial coverage. You have the whole planet, and you have good temporal time coverage too, from the kind of mid 80s to present day. So different tools, but that same metric of greening, NDVI. So now that you're all NDVI greening pros, what does it actually look like? Well, this is a map of Canada that was put together by NASA looking at greening values over the past 30 years. But it's not just a straight up greening value. This is the change in greening over this period of time. So if you are a lighter, like a closer to that white color on this map, you haven't changed in your greening index. So you could be in a forest of big trees 30 years ago. That's still a forest of big trees today. And that's going to show up as that white. Where that green appears on the map, this is where there's been an increase in that greening over that period of time. And so a couple things really jump out at this greening map of the Arctic. One is that the Eastern Arctic is really green. So over that 30-year period that we're looking at, there's been a substantial amount of landscape change. And we can zoom in even further to northern Nunatsiavut in Labrador. And this is really a hot spot for greening. And this is where a lot of our research happens. In Torngat Mountains National Park. Torngat Mountains National Park it's in Nunatsiavut. So it is the traditional territory and land of the Labrador Inuit. And it is also a really great example of a protected area that is managed 100% by Indigenous peoples. So it's managed by the Inuit from Nunatsiavut and Inuit from Nunavik, so the other side of that peninsula. So this is a great example of Indigenous-led management, conservation, and we have had the honor and privilege of working in Torngat Mountains National Park and across Nunatsiavut for the past many years. Just to give some insight into just the overall scope, scale, beauty of Torngat Mountains National Park. It is stunning. If you ever have a chance to go there, it's absolutely worth it. Really a wonderful, beautiful coastal low Arctic landscape. So we're thinking about greening again. And so this is a map that my postdoc in the lab, Emma Davis, put together in a recent publication that looked again at the change in greening from 85 to near present day. So areas that are darker green are those areas that have experienced more change. So when we were at that landscape scale, looking at across Canada, it looked fairly continuously green. So it looked like there wasn't a lot of variability in that greening signal. But when we zoom in to more of a site scale, we can see that it's really patchy, and that greening is restricted to those valley bottoms that you see kind of coming up that center and curling off to the left-hand side. So there are areas that have not greened at all and areas that have greened really significantly. So it is, when you get onto the ground into a smaller scale, it is quite patchy. So we're still up in the satellites, so we want to go down to the ground and start to get a sense of what this greening looks like and what's driving it. And before we get there, this is a map showing vegetation classifications for a very culturally important place, Rama Bay, where Rama Church comes from. And so this is an area that's around 1990 to 1994. And then we're going to look at the 5 years kind of previous to where we are today. So the last 5 years. And you can see the first thing that jumps out at me is a huge increase in that green, the dark green color. So the extent of shrub cover on this landscape. And now I want to take you to those blue triangles. Imagine that the narrow part of that triangle is your eye and you're looking out towards the right. So this is a photograph from that location that was taken in '91 by Angus Simpson. And there is very little shrub cover that is anything beyond a few inches. This is what much of the Eastern Arctic and much of the Arctic looked like. And now let's jump ahead to more current 2018, and there has been a huge increase in that shrub cover. So there, my former PhD supervisor is standing in that image, and you can barely see her because those shrubs have their waist to head height. And so this is a lot of alder. Probably the dominant species is a birch, so a dwarf birch. But there's been a huge amount of change, especially in those low-lying valley areas. And so when we're looking at documenting change, we're using satellite images, but we're also on the ground looking and working with the shrubs themselves. This is our Parks Canada collaborator, Derek Whitaker, holding up a shrub that's been sacrificed in the name of science. And by taking cross sections like you would when you're studying trees, we can look at the number of rings and looking at how old these shrubs are, but also looking at growth rates and recent growth rates that we're seeing accelerate as climate change progresses and the impacts of climate change are amplified in the Arctic. So where are we? We have taller shrubs, and we have new shrubs establishing in areas that were once shrubs that were once shrubs, but now are shrubbed. And these are the signals, these are the processes that are driving this greening pattern. This is a term that in the science world we call shrubification. So not a word that will probably ever appear on a crossword, but it might. It should. But this is the greening of the Arctic is driven by this shrubification. And we think of greening, we think of a lot of talk about greening landscapes, and we think of it as a good thing. But is it a good thing in the Arctic? Well, spoiler, it's not. And I'll show you why in this little step-by-step schematic. So we have traditionally low shrub cover across much of the subarctic and Arctic. Snow falls in the winter and starts to accumulate. You can really tell in the Arctic how deep the snow is going to be in most places by how tall the vegetation is, because the rest of that snow gets blown off. So this is a kind of a schematic just showing you how that snow deposition works across the landscape with small shrubs. Now let's jump up and add shrubification, which we're seeing associated with recent climate change. So we go from small shrub to tall shrub. We add that snow into the mix. You know what happens, it accumulates, the wind comes in, blows the snow, but we're left with much deeper snow. So what we're seeing is that more shrubs on the landscape result in more snow. And it seems strange still that we're talking about snow in this negative context. But what snow does is trap the summer heat in the ground and doesn't give it a chance to refreeze to the same extent that it would otherwise. So when we have more snow, we have more permafrost thaw. More permafrost thaw results in larger shrubs, and you can see this kind of runaway cycle of snow-driven, shrub-driven processes. There is a name, again, this is another word like shrubification that you will maybe never see again, and that's fine, but chianophobia, and no, this is not the fear of Keanu Reeves, this is the fear of snow. So much of the Arctic, it is best if it remains snow-covered, but not deep snow, so the fear of snow. Okay, so a shrubbier landscape is a snowier landscape, more permafrost thaw. What are the implications of this? Well, there are so many, and there are so many kind of ecosystem level changes associated with a shrubbier landscape. And one is that there's a lot of traditional food that is at risk. So as the landscape becomes shrubbier, there are some very serious implications for berries, which I'll talk about in a second. But we're also seeing the shading of the understory. So you have more shrub canopy, you have more moisture trapped underneath the shrubs, and an ecosystem that was dominated by lichens, a hugely important winter forage for caribou, is being shifted to a system that's dominated by moss. And that simple flip from a lichen-dominated to a moss-dominated system has really profound impacts on caribou and how many caribou the landscape can sustain. So an impact on the edible plants and an impact on caribou, and travel routes become more dangerous. So there's many layers to why this shrubbier landscape is a precarious landscape. There have been a lot of work done by members of our team and working with communities in Nunatsiavut in the community of Nain, and working and talking, sharing with elders about changes that have been detected in berries. So this is just a quote from one of the elders from Verona, talking about changes to those to berries within Torngat Mountains National Park. So is greening good? It's good, right? It's good. It's not in the Arctic. A greening Arctic is a very problematic thing. It's a very serious matter. But what about in Southern Ontario? So let's switch gears and go from the Eastern Arctic on Inuit territory, Nunatsiavut, and let's come back closer to, I assume, where many of you are joining us tonight from. So 2 conditions that are driving greening, just so we are back on the same page and everyone's up to speed. So we have the more greenery and ranges changing and species being able to respond and adapt to those changes. And this part of the talk kind of focuses in more on those ranges that are expanding. This is a mesmerizing map put together by the Nature Conservancy that is showing the average direction that mammals in pink, birds in blue, amphibians in yellow need to move to track hospitable climate. So if they're going to stay in climate that they have evolved with and are adapted to, these are the general directions that they are going to have to move. And if we zoom in to Ontario and northern states, we can see some interesting patterns starting to emerge when we think about those responses. We're not talking about plants in this map, but I think that the same theories and the same trends would apply to plants. So we start to see that movement around the Great Lakes. So the lakes as a barrier to movement for most species. So let's zoom in even further, and we can see those corridors. And I think hopefully you'll see where that main corridor is heading through is going to be a very important discussion when we're talking about rare properties and the work around here. What's also really interesting about this region is that we're at an ecotone. We have the Carolinian forest to the south, we have the Great Lake St. Lawrence forest type to the north. And so there's this band where we have really high levels of diversity. And this is the northern edge of where the Carolinian species are found today. And these are the species, this northern edge is what's going to be needing to shift further north to respond to climate change. So there's all kinds of really important biodiversity considerations and issues that are happening right across this ecotone. And so many beloved species, it's like picking your favorite children. It's hard to show the ones that you love the most, but I do have a favorite tree, and that's shagbark hickory, but we have another Carolinian species of redbud, tulip trees, walnut trees, Kentucky coffee trees. So there's an incredible diversity of trees that we're just at the northern edge of. And then in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence, trees that are probably more common and more well-known to many people, thinking about sugar maples and birches and the white pines and red pines. So we're at this really exciting place for biodiversity, but a place that we're expecting, and we are starting to see lots of other examples of this region shifting. So let's jump back into that map, and we're looking at that ecotone. And this is also where rare is. And so rare is really well positioned to be thinking about landscape connectivity, thinking about protected area networks, thinking about this the greater picture, the kind of the landscape level picture. And we can zoom in even further. And one thing that this map has really not taken into account is the habitat that's underpinning these climate connectivity maps. So it's kind of assuming that habitat is continuous. And I think it's pretty safe to say that if you've ever driven around, flown into Pearson, this is a very, very patchy landscape. So we're zoomed in now into that red square. We're looking at NDVI again, so that's that greening. This is from last year's data. In the next few maps I'm going to show you were put together by Emma Davis, the postdoc in the lab, who is a map wizard. And so we're looking at NDVI, a snapshot, so a single year. And when we look at it at this scale, it looks pretty green. And so that's a positive sign. Just for some context, in case the labels on the map are pretty small, so Cambridge and Kitchener, and then we have rare. Hopefully my arrow is fairly close to rare. If we look at the changes in NDVI over this 1985 to 2020 period, some interesting but not surprising patterns start to emerge where around the larger cities, we see more of that red color. So we're seeing a loss of NDVI, loss of greening, in most cases associated with development. And there is some increase in greening, but a lot of it's fairly stable. When we're back now at that snapshot greening map, another thing that jumps out is that the cities are relatively not green. And so we're thinking about barriers, lakes as barriers, and there's a lot of work that we can do when we're thinking about cities. So if we zoom in on this city map and imagine Carolinian species trying to move through this area, seed dispersal at a time, over and over, you could imagine that it's going to be quite tricky for a seed to disperse across that landscape, even though a lot of that surrounding matrix is green. Right now, we're just looking at NDVI. So that green starts to disappear when we're talking about forested areas. So unfortunately, the story is getting a little bit more less good as we go on with these slides, because now the green is not NDVI. This is a map looking at forested areas. So that kind of background of green has really been reduced. So if you're a forest species that needs those conditions for germinating and for persistence, then the amount of space that is available to you has been greatly diminished. And we can zoom in again to that Kitchener, Waterloo, Guelph, Cambridge corridor and see that matrix of forest habitat. And so we can zoom in even further. And I just picked kind of a random point here. Zoom in, we're looking at about 5 kilometers across. So that scale in the bottom left corner is about 1 kilometer. And we can just highlight those forest patches, pull them out. So these are these green blobs, the scientific word is not blob, polygons. These are the forested regions. And then we can start to think about those Carolinian range edges. And so this is going to be the species range limit for a good number of species, not this particular place, but somewhere in this region. And so how do you get from that tree in the southern part of your screen up into the northern part? Well, it really does depend on seed dispersal. And how do those seeds get between those patches? And these are questions that are really at the forefront of our mind in the lab, and really thinking about how do we maintain diversity in this region? How do we help with range expansion? How do we facilitate? How do we make better conservation decisions to help with this connectivity. And this is something that many people are thinking about, and some of the leaders in this are the great folks at Rare who are really thinking about this all the time. How do we connect these patches? This work is really going to be driven, and is driven now, by our PhD student in the lab, Kyle Shang, who's asking all kinds of questions around this range, this edge expansion. So thinking about how can they survive? So if a seedling gets to these areas that are beyond where they're currently growing, can they survive there? How are they going to get there? How far away are these patches from each other? And it becomes a bit of a, almost seems like a game of kind of like hopping from patch to patch, and how far is too far? And can we identify areas where it really is too far for dispersal, for successful dispersal to happen? And then I've kind of fuzzed out all the rest of the map here, just showing the forest. But what about these areas in between? A lot of this is farmland. What is the role of farmland for habitat connectivity? For some species, it might work okay. For some species, it might work really well. For plant species, it may not work as well. But these are all questions that we're thinking about and setting out to answer. So bringing it back to the beginning of the talk, thinking about greening. Two different kind of case study examples, one from the Eastern Arctic, one from Southern Ontario. In the Eastern Arctic, greening is really problematic. We are seeing really significant changes in the ecosystem and how people are using this system because things are greening. In Southern Ontario, a once forested landscape, greening is really critical to conservation success. And if we want to avoid further conservation catastrophe, even though that seems maybe a bit extreme, but if we are looking to have a connected system where species can respond and can extend their range, then that idea of greening becomes really critical. So with that, I would love to hear from anybody with any questions or comments. If you would rather email, please feel free to do that. And so my email is up there. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. We have one question here already from Christine Thompson, who is asking, how does this change in snow permafrost thaw affect the seeds that she understands are stored in the Arctic for future growth?
Oh, that's such a great thing to think about, because there's seed banks in the Arctic that are really persistent. So the example that comes to mind is like there's an Arctic lupin seed that was frozen for over 10,000 years, and they found it in an animal cache, and then they took the seeds and germinated them, and they were still viable. So there's this potential for lost biodiversity, for the maintenance of genetic diversity. So that does happen. In that example, that was something that was in an animal cache. A lot of the seeds in the permafrost, things that are there that are pretty deep in the ground, probably don't have the same level of viability, but that is the potential upside to permafrost thaw. So permafrost is really any ground that has been permanently frozen or frozen for consecutive years. And so even frozen rock is considered permafrost. But for a lot of these soils that are melting, there's a concern about the carbon that's becoming available and becoming decomposed and making its way into the atmosphere associated with permafrost thaw. But I think it's good to kind of balance those perspectives. And there are some positive aspects of that. And one could be seed beds, so seed banks and seeds stored. Another aspect, which I didn't mention, is that all of this shrub growth, that is also sequestering more carbon. So there's some good sides.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andrew. There's a couple of more interesting questions here. John is asking, are you thinking of assisted migration for plants, and would that be gross interference in the natural environment?
Yikes. Yeah, that is a hot topic right now. There are a lot of really polarized views on that. It's not something that we're really thinking about as a solution. So some of the work that we do and the experiments that we run take a similar form to assisted migration, where we're taking seeds and seedlings and planting them further and further north to look at how well they will do in these new climates, these new habitats. But it's more to think about the landscape and how it's connected and how those ranges will expand. It's not as a solution to climate change. So I know there are lots of people thinking about assisted migration. It becomes a very complicated issue of what species do you decide to move. Any sort of intervention has consequences, and so you're promoting one species at the cost of potentially many others, and so those are not decisions that I want to make or am comfortable making.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andrew. There is another follow-up question from John as well, and he's asking, might the new warmth cause paleo seeds to germinate, thus increasing local biodiversity?
It could. Yeah. There is an opportunity to have increased local biodiversity. It's not something I know a lot about in terms of how prolific or how the concentrations of seeds in these seed banks are. But there could be the potential of having species that were once present are no longer present, but their seeds are persistent and are able to come in. So that is potentially a good news aspect.
Wonderful. We have another one that is related to John's previous questions, actually, from Michael. And he's asking, what are the implications of shifting local habitat conditions for biological invasion and the role of non-native species in restoration and conservation?
Oh gosh, that's great. So there is, so when we're talking about species and ranges expanding and finding new habitats, I haven't been differentiating between native species and non-native species. And so there is definitely a complicated aspect to this, where looking at kind of the winners and losers of this, of climate change, and there are species that are very much better at dispersal. So producing more seeds, higher levels of viability, able to disperse further, able to persist longer. And it does seem that those are characteristics often shared or often within invasive species, which is kind of why they are invasive, that they're really good at colonizing and establishing. So it is a problem for restoration. I don't do a lot of restoration work myself, but work and talk to and kind of interact with a lot of restoration ecologists, and that is something that they spend a lot of time thinking about. I know in our region, there's in the kind of Kitchener-Waterloo, Southern Ontario area, there's a lot of issues with invasive species. So like things like buckthorn come to mind, where they're doing well. And so as climate is shifting and the conditions are becoming more favorable to certain species, you do see species like buckthorn doing really well. And so those become pretty hard, kind of deep questions that we need to be asking ourselves about what biodiversity do we value? Do we value native species more than invasive species? And what can we do about it if we decide that we want more native species? So it's a kind of a fascinating topic that I think we could spend probably the rest of the year on. Yeah.
That's at least one other new talk, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And not by me. And I actually saw in one of the participants, Michael McTavish is listening today, and he did his PhD in our department, is now at U of T, and has spent a lot of time thinking about invasive species and the role of earthworms, and thinking about all of these pieces of the system. So there are some really wonderful scientists spending a lot of time thinking about this. So I think it'd be a great topic for a future conversation for conservation.
Absolutely. We should definitely keep that on the radar.
And sorry to put Michael on the hot seat there. So sorry, Mike.
We have a couple of more questions. Marlene is writing that she lives in New Hamburg and they have just started Let's Tree Wilmot with the goal to increase the tree canopy cover. So how could they use this information from your research to determine the tree species they would plant?
That's great. And there's one of the earlier maps looking at the greenness in the cities. It's something that is it's lacking right now, and there's a lot of room for improvement. So I'm really pleased and excited to hear about thinking about canopy cover. There is so much value in increasing canopy cover. So the climate cooling effects that urban trees have is just so incredibly important, and there's some really interesting work looking at kind of that socioeconomic footprint of canopy trees, and wealthier areas have a much more established canopy compared to poorer areas, which is really problematic. And so thinking about connectivity and thinking about spreading that canopy cover across a region, so whether it's a smaller community like New Hamburg or something larger like Kitchener, but thinking, I know the question was about species, so I'll get to that in a second, but just thinking about looking at a map and trying to think about corridors and think about connectivity, and thinking about if a species, if it's a mammal, if it's a bird, if it's a plant that wants to make its way through the city slowly, if you're a plant, but think about, will that be possible? So just where those trees get planted is really important. In terms of species, there's lots of different opinions on it, whether to go with species that are have been selected for rapid growth, and so you might get a canopy faster, or focusing on native species. Ultimately, a tree that provides canopy cover and that cooling effect is the best tree you can have. So that's the first thing, is like, don't have it interfere with your ability to plant a tree. So native or non-native, in my opinion, a tree provides so many ecosystem services. If there was a choice between a native and a non-native species, I'd be thinking about Carolinian species that are, maybe it was potentially a bit too cool for them to be living here, but now as things warm, it's a pretty good spot. So I'd be focusing on native trees, with the caveat being that any tree is going to be providing canopy cover and lots of other ecosystem services. So any tree is a good tree, but then if there's a choice, and it sounds like you do have a choice, then I would be focusing on native Carolinian species.
That's a wonderful answer, Andrew. And in fact, you partially answered the next question as well, because Christine was asking, how does RARE's goal of creating a mosaic of connected spaces, connectivity, or corridors help with the migration of tree species?
Yeah, and so that is like, I guess we need to start thinking about landscapes as corridors, and as thinking about how we can get a species from below to above, so from further south to further north. And that the map that had the climate connectivity, those beautiful streaking colors that I kind of just sometimes go onto that website and stare at it for hours, is mesmerizing. But thinking about those corridors, and they're quite coarse. They're not telling you exactly where species are going to need to be, but it does show you that general route that species will be moving through this landscape. So having those corridors and thinking about connectivity is how that's going to happen. So depending on what species you are, your dispersal distance or migration distance, how far you can move, really depends on, if you're a bird, how big your wings are, how much your fat storage is, and all these other factors. Plants rely on dispersal. So how are your seeds going to get there? And so they really, in almost all cases, we do see long distance dispersal, but a lot of that dispersal, it's this slow march of species in this landscape heading further north. And if you're near the mountains, then things are going higher in elevation. So those corridors and rare's that vision for connectivity is going to become increasingly more important as we move through these years.
Great, Andrew. We have time for maybe a couple more questions. So there is one from John who is asking, in the Torngat Mountains, could black spruce and tamarack move in behind the alder and dwarf birch shrubs?
Yes. So there are a few trees in the Torngats that we have come across in our travels. There's I believe it's the Ivitek Valley that runs from the Nunavik side, so the Quebec side, across to Nunatsiya. That there's this long valley finger, and there are black spruce like kind of marching up into the park. It's a slow march, but it is totally possible. The postdoc that I keep talking about, Emma Davis, she has done some work looking at projections of shrub cover change moving forward. And there's the projections for the next like 20, 30, 40 years are a significant increase in shrub cover, especially around those valley bottoms. And so it would also be, it would be logical and probably quite possible that you would also start to see tree dispersal and trees moving into that area. It's probably a longer term pattern, but they are close by, and there are white spruce on the coast that are not that far away, that are kind of right now fairly secluded to really protected low-lying areas, but there's a seed source. And if you have a landscape that's covered in snow, not a lot of snow because a lot of it gets blown off, seeds can go a really long distance up north. And so a few long distance seed dispersal events could really change the tree cover in the park, which is really hard to think about an Arctic park that's dominated by a low shrub tundra becoming treed, but it's happened in the past, and the conditions are unfortunately there to happen again.
Great. And we have one more here from Michelle, who is saying, here in Cambridge, a large portion of our tree canopy is a non-native species, the Norway maple, which spreads really well, grows rapidly. However, in the past few years, tar spot has proliferated. The trees are losing leaves in July now due to this disease and changing climate. So they are green for a much shorter time. Any hope for that to change?
My honest answer is I'm not sure. But yeah, Norway maples have been a very popular tree for planting for a long time. They grow well, and they seem to do well in this climate, but I'm not sure about the longer term projections for Norway maple.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, there's a couple of short things here that are actually in the chat window. Melanie's asking if we can access the website with the streaming map. There's a link. You can share that.
Yeah, yes, I will share that. Maybe I can do two things at once.
We can also send that out later as part of the follow-up.
Yeah, it's a really neat product. But I'll pass it on, and it's really focused on North America, but you can zoom in. I think is the last map that I showed with just the kind of Southern Ontario chunk. I think that's as far in as you can zoom, but there's a lot of really interesting research that's underpinning that product, but the product is really mesmerizing, and it's a great science communication tool to think about landscape change and think about how species move across the landscape.
Wonderful. And Hughley is asking, the region of Waterloo is developing a climate action plan. Has the region approached your department or RARE for input on the plan?
I can't speak to RARE, but I believe that there have been a number of people on campus who have been a part of the plan, but I'm not positive.
Yeah, we've not been approached directly, but we are aware of it, and we are kind of on that general distribution list to review the plan and comment on it. And so we've been working on that. Wonderful. I think these are all the questions. There's lots of praise and thanks for you in the chat window as well, Andrew. That was really a great presentation. So thank you so much for being with us here tonight. My sincere apologies for the tech glitch earlier. I've been having some issues with my computer and it was supposed to be fixed, but it seems like it's still a little bit unstable. So I hope I can get your attention still for another 5 minutes so that we can wrap this up here, because what I was actually speaking about just before Andrew was starting was I was saying it has been such a nice day today and the weather has been warming up, and it's very exciting because our trails typically open on March 15th, the few handful that we have to close over winter. And so all our trails are fully open and free and available for everyone to visit. So if you want to go out on a nice spring hike, please come to Rare and enjoy the trails. And obviously, exploring the forest and other landscapes at Rare is always a fun activity. So if you like that, and if you enjoyed the presentation here today, and hopefully also enjoy the movie, I wanted to share with you that, as many of you know, we have an ambitious goal to achieve before spring arrives, to really keep our trails open and to protect our forests. And as always, we need your help for this. So alongside the Rare Board of Directors, we are asking you to help us turn the map green and raise $30,000 before Earth Day, which is April 22nd, to protect these local lands forever. And there's a lot at stake if we don't protect our sensitive green spaces, obviously, because the rare forests in particular contain old growth remnant trees that we protect. And this habitat actually has some trees that are now over 260 years old. So while our event and film screening here tonight is free to really make it accessible and available to all, we invite you to contribute to protecting a piece of this incredible forest. And for a donation of as little as $2 per square meter, you can go green today on St. Patrick's Day. It's probably cheaper than a pint of beer, actually, and turn the map green with us. So leave your green mark here tonight to protect those woodlands and forests forever. And I'm very excited to share that we are over halfway to this fundraising goal since the last Conversation for Conservation event, and we have raised $18,887 already. So thank you everyone who has supported us already. And we will also be sending out an email after the event, not just with the link to the map, but also to this fundraising campaign. So thank you everyone again for joining us here tonight, and particularly thank you to Andrew for an absolutely excellent and interesting presentation and all the good questions that were triggered by this. And I would also really like to thank the staff that helped to make this event possible, especially Temena Kohi behind the scenes, who is really making sure that all the tech has been running smoothly with the webinars and the various Zoom sessions that we're having. And also Laura Klein for a lot of the organizing behind the scenes. And don't forget, the movie is still available starting as of 9 p.m. So you have kind of time for a 5-minute snack break to get yourself ready before you can start watching the movie and until Sunday evening. Happy St. Patrick's Day, and also happy International Day of Forests on this weekend. And we really hope that we can see you again at our next Conversation for Conservation, which will happen in April. And thank you very much and have a good night.